We've covered some of the aspects of fair housing, what it is, its history, and its impact on the real estate industry. Now we'll look at fair housing from a legal perspective. Some of the laws and regulations we'll be talking about were briefly mentioned earlier. The reason we're examining them in more detail is due to their importance and continued relevance to real estate agents. The first fair housing legislation we'll look at in detail is the Fair Housing Act. Officially known as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act is one of the most fundamental pieces of legislation in regard to discrimination and housing. It sets the modern baseline for what constitutes a protected class. It also establishes the essential do's and don'ts when it comes to real estate and discrimination. Even among real estate professionals, it is not commonly known that a number of the regulations contained within the Fair Housing Act can actually be enforced as criminal statutes, and they're enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice. But the Fair Housing Act isn't the only major federal law that addresses the issue of fair housing. There are regulations like the Architectural Barriers Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Each of these laws deals with discrimination as it relates to both physical and mental disabilities. As well as these laws, Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972 targeted sex discrimination on college campuses, and the Age Discrimination Act, as the name states, was designed to combat discrimination based on physical age. From time to time, our presidents have also issued executive orders that have set down the fair housing regulations. These orders have covered everything from discrimination by federally assisted contractors to environmental justice. Executive orders are a kind of written directive that the president will use to work their agenda through the executive branch of our government. Executive orders and proclamations of general applicability and legal effect must be published in the Federal Register. While executive orders can be used to execute a power the president already has, they cannot be used to grant a president new powers. Some of the executive orders we'll talk about have been precursors for later civil rights legislation. Others have added to the protections already in place. The last area we'll explore is Michigan's fair housing laws. Specifically, we'll discuss common law, the Elliot-Larsen Civil Rights Act, and the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act. Common law is regulation that mainly comes out of court decisions and judicial opinions. The common law basis for fair housing in Michigan is primarily based on an opinion of the Michigan Supreme Court. The court held that, quote, there's a civil right to private housing both at common law and under the 1963 Michigan Constitution where that housing has been publicly offered for sale by one who is in the business of selling housing to the public, end quote. This declaration came out of Beech Grove Investment Company et al. Versus Civil Rights Commission of the State of Michigan. This was a case that came before the Michigan Supreme Court in 1968, and it involved the refusal of the investment group to sell property to an African American couple. The primary fair housing law in Michigan, though, is the Elliot-Larsen Civil Rights Act. This law took effect March 31, 1977. And replaced the old Michigan Fair Housing Act of 1968. This act guarantees many of the same things granted by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Housing Act. The Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act was passed in 1976. It extended fair housing protections to people with mental or physical disabilities, and it effectively amended the Elliot-Larsen Civil Rights Act. The laws and regulations we'll look at form a significant part of the regulatory framework you'll work within. Fair housing is more than just an ethical mandate to treat members of the public fairly. It's something that's backed up by laws of the nation and the individual states. You need to understand both the purpose of fair housing and the legal structure that supports and enforces fair housing efforts. With that in mind, let's dive into the Fair Housing Act.